It was the story of the Chariot of Fire, and only two duchies have managed to become famous in the 1,700 years of their empire's glorious history. Was the venerable Park family, who were celebrated for their deeds, and another family that was a major player in the financial services industry, the Serpent family. And even though the Serpent family couldn't boast a large family pedigree, they owned the largest bank in the world. And the Park family played a crucial role in the establishment of the empire. And it was the Park family that was the family of the protagonist of this novel, whose name was Adriana, and she was the only daughter and favorite of the Park family. But after her mother died, her stepmother and stepbrother came into the family, and after all the troubles of the protagonist, a plague took her father away from her. But despite this and her grief and sorrow for her father and mother, Adriana never ceased to be kind and warm to those around her. So she devoted herself to charity in the capital of the empire, where there was a plague epidemic at the time, and there she met the crown prince. It was a fine young man who was the protagonist of this novel, and the story ended up being about the two main characters struggling with other people's attacks, and overcame the hardships and adversity they encountered along the way. And in the end, like in any fairy tale, they married and lived happily ever after in love. But like any beautiful fairy tale, this one also had its villains. And they were two brothers from the Serpent family who lived 2 years abroad to escape the plague, and the woman who turned the entire empire into chaos. Her name was Sasha Sanchez, and as in all fairy tales, the villains met a grisly end. But no one really had any idea what their story was, and no one knew the circumstances in which they all found themselves. It was 1720 at the Serpent family estate, and then two young men were discussing that heaven was indeed madly cruel, for they had first taken her imperial majesty, and now also her ladyship, the Duke-Duchess. And since now these fine people were not with them two young gentlemen, and also young ladies remained after them, then another girl joined in the conversation between the two young men, who sadly reported that she was really sorry that they had lost the Duke and Duchess because they had been taken away by the Great Plague. They were really good people, and then they looked at the red-haired girl and said that it must have been very hard for the girl, and she was in great shock, because not so long ago she had lost her mother, and now she had lost the people she admired so much. And then the protagonist herself, standing at the tombstone of the Duke and Duchess, apologized to them for not being able to protect them while Sasha hugged their only daughter. And then she started to remember that her mom worked for the Serpent family, and they were simple peasants. But the Duke and Duchess of Serpent were very warm to them, so Sasha Sanchez thought she was living a very happy life. Until one day she woke up, and her head was hit by the memories. And then thinking about it, Sasha finally realized that she wasn't because of this world. And she died after being stuck in the elevator of an old house on a cold winter night, because she was an orphan and had no relatives at all. So nobody cared about her death. And the main character's memories came back to her on the very day when the Great Plague took her mother away from her. And then Sasha Sanchez realized that the world that she liked so much was described in a novel that she had read before she died in a previous life. And all these years she had been living in a fictional world without realizing it. And so it seemed to her that her whole life had been a sham. And she didn't even have time to grieve for her mother because fate was too cruel to give her time. And so she took the Duke and the Duchess as well. And then looking at their graves, Sasha Sanchez turned to the deceased and promised that she would protect their children. But eventually, the next morning, the girl woke up and realized she wasn't in her room and didn't know where she was. And then looked around to see that she didn't remember Estelle falling asleep with her last night. But at that moment, the girl opened her eyes, and the 12-year-old wondered how long had Sasha Sanchez been in her bed and what was even going on. But then the protagonist scrutinized her, stroked Estelle's head, and mentally noted that the girl was still not fully awake. Then she told her that Estelle had probably forgotten how she had come to her bed and had fallen asleep. But at that moment, there were two guys outside their door who heard a voice coming from the room of Sasha Sanchez and the girls, and therefore realized that they were there. So they immediately opened the doors after knocking, and after a careful look at them, they realized that they had no idea that the two of them were also in this place. And then the protagonist looked them over and awkwardly wondered what they were doing here. Then she realized that it was Alicia's and Benya, but she didn't understand what was going on. But at that moment, after looking her over, Lycius asked Sasha had she really brought them to this dark, strange castle of the Demon King. This boy was 15 years old. But at that moment, Benita spoke to him. He was 14 then, and he asked Lydia's a little reproachfully why he was saying such terrible things. and said that from the outside it looked as if his older brother's intelligence was clearly overrated. Then grudgingly announced that they had woken up and found themselves in a room they had never seen before. And so anyone would think it was all a prank. Sasha Sanchez thought about what they had said and realized that apparently neither Licious nor Benya knew where they were. And if she had understood correctly, neither of them understood how they could have fallen asleep in one place and ended up in another. But at that moment, Benya spoke, looking around and saying that they needed to think things over first and asking if there was a similar room in their estate. But then when he got no answer from Lydia's, he said that his older brother was really so stupid, although he was the firstborn, and he should have known about such things. But at that moment, the madman looked around at his younger brother and said that Benya also had no idea where they were. Then he said that he had never seen this place in their estate before. But Benya only grudgingly said that if he didn't know the place, then Licious must have known about it, since he was the first child, after which they began to argue angrily among themselves, while their younger sister and the protagonist watched on excitedly. And then Sasha Sanchez thought that they were right, because in all of her time working at the estate, she had never seen anything like this place at Serpent Manor. And then she thought that she remembered that yesterday they had buried the Duke and Duchess. But while she was thinking, Lydia's hand was on her shoulder, and he calmly informed Sasha that the game was supposed to be over. But she only wondered what game he was talking about. And then Lydia smiled happily and said that Sasha Sanchez and the other servants must have been playing a joke on them. But she wondered if he really suspected her. But in the next moment, as a confirmation of words, Lydia said that more than sure that Sasha Sanchez with the rest of the servants were definitely capable of such a thing. And displeased with the protagonist thought that if the servants found out, it would definitely go crazy, because to place such away children from a noble family was simply unforgivable. At that moment, a worried Estelle came up to her and took the girl by the sleeve and told her that she was insanely stuffy, and that was why she wanted to get out of here. But Sasha Sanchez extra cleverly stroked her head and said that she, too, thought that it was crazy stuffy in here. Then she thought that Estelle would never believe that she had decided to play a joke on them like that. But the next moment she saw her madly disgruntled face and realized that even this girl seemed to think it was her fault. So she excitedly tried again to explain to Estelle that she was not at all to blame. But at that moment, Benya intervened in their conversation, pointing to the door behind his back, and said that they had come from the lower floor, and that while they were going upstairs they had looked around, but had found nothing. But then Sasha Sanchez thoughtfully said that there must have been some kind of exit downstairs. After all, it made sense if they were in one of the rooms of their estate. But then Lydia's awkwardly reported that they really hadn't found a way out, and they checked everywhere while Sasha Sanchez and Estelle slept, and said there was a bathroom down the hall and a dining room at the end, but nothing else. But at that moment, Sasha Sanchez calmly informed Licious that she was more than sure that he seemed to have missed something, and at that moment, the insanely disgruntled guy screeched out of his seat and informed Sasha that there really wasn't anything there, and she only awkwardly agreed with his words. And then she suggested that they go and check around again. In the end, they all went down together. Licious went first, followed by Sasha Sanchez and Estelle, and Benya was at the end, making sure they didn't get lost. And eventually, as she descended through the insanely stuffy room, she realized that she hadn't seen a single door, although there was bound to be at least one. But the next moment, Sasha Sanchez stepped on the glass that was on the stairs. Then she screamed out loud. And because of her fright, Estelle was also scared out of her mind, who screamed with Sasha. But at that moment, not even trying to hold back their laughter, Licious and Benya looked at them and wondered what it was all about. But a disgruntled Sasha Sanchez just hugged a frightened Estelle and asked the guys why they were laughing at all. But at that moment, with tears in his eyes, Benya admitted that they only laughed because it was really crazy funny, because they both screamed like little piglets. The protagonist was about to say something to them, but the next moment she immediately became silent at half a word because she noticed the mirror that was in front of them. And looking at it, I thought that I couldn't even imagine that it could be in such a place. So I came closer and wondered how a mirror could appear in such a completely uninhabited place, especially since it was so big and tall, as if it was made for an adult. But after scrutinizing her reflection and the reflections of Licious, Benya, and Estelle, the protagonist stated that because of this mirror, she had a strange feeling for some reason. But at that moment, seeing her strange expression, she was gently touched on the shoulder by Benya, who asked the girl if she was okay. And she just looked at him excitedly and told him that everything was fine, and said that they had probably been moved to this place because of the plague as a temporary shelter. And then thinking about it, Benya said that maybe they had been moved here while they slept, so they wouldn't be so scared of what had happened. But then Sasha Sanchez looked carefully at the boy in front of her and gently inquired what exactly him had been told by his relatives while they were talking yesterday. And he calmly looked at the girl and told her that their relatives had offered them to stay for a while in Sai because of the conditions that were in the capital. And they also said that they couldn't afford to lose them after what had happened to their parents. And then Sasha Sanchez thought about his words and realized that everything was exactly the same as in the novel. But there was still something insanely strange. After all, the serpent children were supposed to leave for school right after the Duke and Duchess funeral, and she didn't understand why they were here now if they were supposed to leave, and wondered if she had missed something while she was reading the novel. But I realized that she really remembered everything correctly, and so I started to remember if there was any mention of their lives in the novels, other than the fact that they studied abroad for 2 years. And she tried to remember at least one phrase that would describe the lives that the children actually lived, and then excitedly thought that nothing like that was described in the book, and so excitedly asked the boys did they really say absolutely nothing else. But Benya only rubbed his neck and asked what Sasha was interested in and said that during the conversation their uncle had also told them that Sasha Sanchez was to go with him to study. So he was sure that their relatives had understood everything correctly, so she shouldn't have worried. Because without Sasha, they wouldn't have been able to handle their crying sister who was at this moment clinging excitedly to her older brother. Then looked around frightened, the girl reported that she was hearing some strange sounds that were coming from the mirror. And then all the shocked turned to that side and also heard some unknown creak that came from that side of the mirror. But after a moment, it started to move away. And as it turned out, it was a door. And then Sasha Sanchez looked at this picture and wondered if this was one of the passageways that had brought them to this place. Because the next moment the door opened wide, and then the children's faces were illuminated by a bright light. And the man asked excitedly if the children were all right. The protagonist, excitedly looking at it, stated that it was Uncle Jerome Hippolyte. And so Sasha Sanchez immediately began to remember what exactly she knew about this man. Immediately crept into my head memories when still little Estelle clung to the dress of her nanny, the mother of the protagonist, and cried madly bitterly. And the excited Jerome Hippolyte leaned toward her and asked why his dear lady was crying. But the girl said she had lost her Miss Wendy. And then the excited man inquired who it was. And the protagonist's mother explained that this was the name of the doll that his lordship had given Estelle. And then remembering this doll, the man immediately awkwardly wondered if Estelle valued the thing so much. And then the woman calmly explained that she had already sent a maid to bring the doll, and then pointed her finger in the direction of the fleeing Sasha Sanchez, said that the maid had already arrived. And then the madly excited Estelle immediately turned around and looked for Sasha. And then madly out of breath and obviously tired after a long run, the main character held out the doll, said that it was Miss Wendy, and then taking the doll in his hands and handing it joyfully to Estelle, Uncle Jerome Hippolytus asked the girl to take good care of the doll if it was so important to her, and she only promised joyfully that she would look after it. So remembering all this, Sasha Sanchez could state that this man was kind to his niece and nephews, and always found time to play with them, and he was a favorite relative of the Serpent family children. At least, this is the kind of man the protagonist imagined Jerome Hippolyte to be. But this moment, she was at once transported to a harsh reality, and then turning to Jerome Hippolyte. Benya excitedly informed her uncle that they had already begun to fret madly and had begun to make up extra for themselves. So she inquired what this place was. And at that moment, an excited Estelle came close to Jerome Hippolyte and grabbed his pant leg and said that she was insanely hungry. And also it was very stuffy in this place. And so she wanted to walk around a bit. But the man met all those words with a maddeningly cold and devastated look, and he seemed disconnected from everything that was going on. And then scrutinizing his face, Sasha Sanchez only wondered why he was looking at the children so strangely, as if he was not in this place right now. But the next moment, the man smiled awkwardly, and it informed the children that they had other things to do first, and suggested they sit down and talk. Then when they were at the kitchen table, the man reported that he had to start their conversation by saying that everyone seemed to be very surprised, and then stated that it must have been a great surprise to all of them that their room had changed while they slept. Sasha Sanchez wondered how it could be interpreted. It was obvious that they had just been moved while they slept. And then Benya entered the conversation, who looked at his uncle carefully and said that they were indeed a little agitated, and asked if they were now in their estate. When Jerome Hippolyte heard this question, he calmly explained that every noble family had such a secret room in the manor. And Sasha Sanchez, who was listening to all this, only hoped that they were not locked in this room forever. Then looked at the man in front of her, who still looked really devastated. And then without too much emotion, Jerome Hippolyte informed that they would have to change some of their plans they had before. And then the excited Benya only asked what Jerome Hippolyte wanted to tell them. And the excited Estelle and Sasha Sanchez only looked at him expecting some further explanations. And then rubbing his eyes awkwardly, Jerome Hippolyte said that they had made the decision that it was too risky to send the children from here to the port, and hoped that they were all well aware of the situation that was in the capital of the empire, because although Her Imperial Majesty and the parents of these children never spent time on the streets, but they still contracted the plague, and no one knows how people contracted the disease. So the plague was considered God's punishment. Then added excitedly that it was for this reason that they had quickly moved all the children to this place where they thought it would be safest. And looking over his nephews, said that young children like Benyat, Estelle, and Licia's were most vulnerable to the plague, and added that for centuries the place had been closed and unused. But after thinking about what he said, Sasha Sanchez realized that it wasn't God's bark. This mysterious plague would end as suddenly as it had begun. But of course, the shock and fear of it would linger for a while, so it was the smartest decision for Jerome to restrict his nephews from the disease. But she didn't understand why she had such strange feelings about it. But afterward, her agitation did not go unnoticed by Benjamin, who looked at her carefully and simply remained silent, and seemed to share her feelings completely. Whereupon Jerome Hippolytus looked attentively and inquired, did they really have to stay in this very place from now on? And then the man calmly reported that they did. And at this point, the insanely disgruntled Estelle immediately declared that she would not want to stay here, because it was quite stuffy, and it was just morally hard to be here. But the worried man said as calmly as possible that it wouldn't be long, then added that they didn't really have a choice, and they had to wait here for a while. Then in a panic, I hold my hands on my head, and looking at one point said that he just cannot afford to lose his nephews. And it seems looking at such a worried uncle, everyone present understood his feelings. And so Lycias only looked at him carefully and asked how long they would be here. Benya said that he was actually quite annoyed at the mere thought of sleeping in the same room with Lydia's, but he only shouted at his little brother in frustration and demanded that he just shut up. At this point, the man looked at his nephews more calmly and said that they would be here for a week at the most, but not longer, and it would be ideal if they left this country as soon as possible. But for now, they had to live here for a while. But Jerome Hippolytus calmly explained that it was so, but he added that they need not worry because the butler would bring food and whatever they needed. Then he thought it was time for him to leave and told the children that the plague could be transmitted through the air, and so he asked them not to even think about leaving the place. But the agitated and disgruntled Benya reported that it was quite dark, stuffy, and perhaps even scary. But the frantic and uncomfortable man only asked that they be patient for a while. Then he turned to the protagonist and said that Sasha Sanchez must have realized that Estelle needed her, and that as soon as the situation improved, Sasha Sanchez would follow the girl as her personal maid during her training. And so he asked Sasha Sanchez to continue to take care of his niece, just as she had always done. And Sasha Sanchez just bowed and said that she would. After looking at everyone carefully one last time, the man said that in that case, they really didn't need to worry because the butler would bring them food soon. And as he walked through his doors looking around at the children seeing him off, he told them that they would definitely see each other next week. Finally, after some time, a butler came down to the children, who bowed and apologized to the young master for the circumstances under which he had come to the boy's service. Then he told them that his name was Karis, and he was the new butler. But the excited Lycias asked why they had a new butler, for he had not been warned of anything of the kind before. But he calmly explained that he had taken up his post as of today, and therefore he could not have informed him earlier. Lycias looked at him carefully and wondered what had happened to the old butler, and whether he had decided to resign without telling him. Sasha Sanchez looked at the boy in front of her, and thought that she sometimes forgot that this boy was the first son in the Serpent family, and therefore he was the most important, and then thought about who this boy was and who he would become in the future. And then stated that after returning from abroad, Lycias became a duke and together with Benya took control of the underworld. As for their sister, her fragile health probably deteriorated quickly during her stay abroad. But the next moment she was jerked out of her musings by Lysias's shout, who wondered if their last butler had suddenly died. And then Horace said as calmly as he could that it was so, and unfortunately the last butler had been taken by the plague and had died this morning. And that was why, due to the gravity of all the circumstances, Harris would be the only servant to visit the place. Then, looking carefully at everyone present, he said that he understood their concern, but that they should never leave this place under any circumstances, because there was a risk that they could be infected with the plague. He then turned his attention to Sasha and said that he would now tell her duties, and was displeased about something when he looked at her, but then calmly pointed to the trays of food and said that Sasha Sanchez would serve the food according to the schedule, and added that here was breakfast, lunch, and dinner arranged from left to right. But the flustered protagonist only wondered, did he really mean that the butler would only visit them once a day? But he looked seriously at the protagonist and said that Sasha Sanchez was old enough to realize that as butler he could not come here for any reason, because any outsider coming in and out of this place was a great threat to the young gentleman and also to my lady. And then Sasha Sanchez, thinking about it, stated that he was right, but she was worried about something, and so she excitedly asked her what they should do when the food ran out. But he looked at the girl scornfully and told her that she didn't have to worry about that. She just had to leave the cart by the mirror door, and then he would pick it up while everyone was asleep, and then wish her well, and close the mirror doors behind him. And then Sasha Sanchez scrutinized the mirror and probed it, and found that the door was locked from the outside, and then began to think anxiously about what would happen if at that moment Estelle were to fall ill. After all, when the Duke and Duchess passed away, Sasha Sanchez realized that he could not change the plot of the novel, and so began to feel very much for this little girl. Estelle was often sick, and in the novel it happened when she was abroad, and that's where she died. But after thinking about it, she stated that once they leave the tower and the boys go to school with Estelle, Sasha Sanchez will be able to protect Estelle as before. But at that moment, noticing her concern, Benya came up to her and asked what Sasha Sanchez was doing, because she had heard the butler's word that it was dangerous outside. But she only calmly reported that she thought it was crazy weird. But Benya approached the mirror and asked what exactly she thought was weird. And then Sasha Sanchez looked closely at the boy and admitted that it was crazy weird that they locked them in here all of a sudden and didn't even explain anything at first. But after thinking about it for a while, Benya calmly said that maybe they were just really worried that they might get desperate and run away. That's why they decided to do it that way. And thinking about the boy's words, Sasha Sanchez realized that it did make sense. But she didn't understand why she had such a bad feeling about the whole thing, because she knew what was going to happen in the future. But she had no way of knowing the details, and she didn't have to panic every time something unexpected happened. So she decided she needed to think of a plan. And at that moment, a worried Estelle ran up to her and hugged her tightly and told her that she was hungry. And looking at her with sparkling eyes asked if the main character is not yet hungry. And then carefully looking at the girl, Sasha Sanchez realized that first she should worry about the children. And so she gathered up her hair and also arranged all the dishes on the table and announced that everything was ready. And so she invited them to the table. And then looking at the variety of dishes, Benya calmly told Lysias that it seemed that now he could no longer complain about the food, for the variety was very small. But the disgruntled boy only wondered why complain at all after all. You could have just waited a few days for the food to change. But Benya calmly explained that Lysias had always been the kind of person who complained all the time. But he only shouted and asked what his brother actually meant. And listening to all their arguments, Sasha Sanchez wondered unhappily when these boys would be able to grow up and behave normally. At that moment, there was an outraged shout from Lysias, who looked around the table in shock and asked if there was no syrup for the pancakes because that was a crime, and seemed really shocked by something like that. But at this point, Sasha Sanchez looked around the table disgruntled, wondering what in the world was now in the bottle next to Lysias. And he awkwardly looked around and finally managed to spot the syrup for the pancakes. So he awkwardly rubbed his head and immediately apologized to Sasha for being so inattentive. But she exhaled and just asked the boy to pass her the syrup, and she would pour it for everyone. But he calmly said he could handle it himself, and then started pouring the pancakes and poured more than he needed, so he spilled it all on the table. That's why disgruntled Benya only wondered what Lysias was doing now. Then approached and began to take the syrup away from him. But he only grudgingly informed Benya that it was high time he showed some respect. But the disgruntled Benya only wondered angrily why Lysias could be respected at all, and whether he thought that his pouring syrup on the table was worthy of respect. But he only grudgingly reported that his younger brother would have done the same, for he was no better. But the next moment, Estelle's fists hit the table and stopped their argument, and reported that she was insanely hungry. And then the agitated Ligias and Benya only looked at her in silence. And then, giving them the most displeased look, Estelle asked if they could stop fighting, or at least do it after they had eaten in peace. And then, seeing such a stern little sister, they immediately calmed down. And looking back at this picture, the main character only thought about the fact that it was really incredible, because Estelle had a really combative character, but not in all situations. In the end, after some time, most of the plates were empty, and then everyone stated that they were finally full and even a little bit full, and they seemed insanely happy and satisfied. The fact that this place had not been used for a long time only increased his curiosity, and he had never even guessed that there was such a shelter in their manor. But then, looking him over carefully, Benya wondered, did his brother know absolutely nothing about it? After all, he was the heir, and he should know their estate insanely well. But he only grudgingly served his younger brother's plate, and wondered what he was talking about, for he had not been told any of this. For as heir, he had much to learn. Then he sadly began to remember his father who had said those words to him, and he was at once madly pained by such memories. At this point, Benya also began to remember their late father and mother, and so he also became very sad. But he tried to keep his cool and keep his composure. But at that moment, the main character was approached by the insanely sad Estelle, who tried not to cry and said that she also missed her father insanely much, and she was insanely lonely all this time. Then, approaching the protagonist so she could hug her, she confessed that she also missed her mother and Sylvia very much. And at that moment, when she heard her mother's name, Sasha Sanchez hugged Estelle and could hold back her tears, because although she remembered her past life, she had no parents in her past life, and that was the reason why she considered Sylvia her real mother, and she loved her very much. A little while later, Sasha went downstairs alone, where the boys were, and then they looked at Sasha and asked her where their little sister was. But Sasha Sanchez calmly reported that the girl was trying to sleep. And then, thinking about it, the awkward guys reported that it must have been crazy hard for Estelle, and she was very worried because she usually couldn't fall asleep in her bed for a long time. But Benya calmly informed his older brother that unfortunately, there was nothing they could do about it. But Sasha Sanchez calmly said that she had fallen asleep, so she asked what they were going to do now. And then Benya suggested that they go on a little reconnaissance. But Sasha Sanchez only wondered what he meant by reconnaissance. And Benya calmly said that while they were going through the whole place, they noticed a strange place downstairs, and there was some room that looked like an office or a warehouse. Sasha looked at him with a smile and said that they didn't know what could be there yet. That's why they had to check everything thoroughly. She was only excited and said that they had to leave the place after a few days, so she'd asked why they had to go there. But Benya calmly said that this was the reason why they had to explore the place, because they would not be there for a long time after their departure. But Sasha Sanchez only thought about the fact that the place was insanely dark, damp, and very old, and smelled bad. But she admitted that now she was also curious. And then, looking around carefully, I wondered what this place was originally meant for. It was too old for a noble family, but it was too big for the servants. And perhaps that's why this place was perfect as a hiding place. But at that moment, with a smile, Lethia said that if Sasha Sanchez and Benya were going, he wanted to go too. And he offered to take candles with him because it was really dark in that place. Then they lit the lamps and happily headed in that direction. And the excited Sasha Sanchez, who was walking beside them, was just thinking about what she could do to keep the boys out of trouble. Eventually, after a while, they went below, and then were in a huge office, and looking around this room, one of them stated that it was really huge. And Sasha Sanchez calmly noticed that apparently it was a library, because there was an insane amount of books and also a lot of dust. But Benya only calmly reported that there was quite strange that in such a place there was also a library. But the next moment, while Sasha Sanchez was quietly looking over the books that were there was an enthusiastic shout at Ligias, who had found something really marvelous, which scared the girl madly. And then she turned around unhappily and asked Ligias to stop scaring her so much. But he only looked behind her back excitedly and suggested that she look for herself. And then, looking at the place where the boy was pointing his finger, Sasha Sanchez found that there was a window that was covered with a cloth. And then, excitedly looking out of it, Sasha Sanchez wondered if they could see what was visible from that window. Perhaps they could see where they were now. But then, looking out the window, everyone wondered how they could climb up there. It was really high up. But at that moment, Benya calmly pointed to the ladder and said they could use it to climb higher. But at that moment, looking at the ladder, Benya realized that although it was quite long, it looked very old, and therefore it might not be reliable. And then Sasha Sanchez thought that maybe they should look for another ladder. But Lidia's, looking at the other staircases that were in the area and had been broken, said that this was probably the only staircase that had survived over the years, and Benya only wondered what they should do. But at that moment, Lidia's looked at the protagonist and realized that Sasha Sanchez was the lightest of them all and therefore had the best chance of climbing up and coming down without breaking anything. At that moment, he was confronted with a displeased look from Sasha and his brother. And so Lidia's was puzzled as to what this was about. But the madly displeased Benya said that even though Lidia's was trying to act madly well-mannered, but in reality, he was just being a coward. But when he heard those words, he immediately shook himself and tried to explain that it wasn't like that at all. That's not what he meant. And if there was a chance, he wouldn't risk Sasha, but explained that if the ladder did fail, they could safely catch Sasha. But if he fell, for example, Benya and Sasha would probably just scatter instead of catching him, so he had less chance of surviving. But at that moment, thinking about his words, the insanely disgruntled Benya asked if he had been in Lidia's place and had also fallen from a height, he would not have caught him. But the insanely calm Lidia's said with a smile that that was exactly what he would have done, as there was no point in helping his younger brother. But at this moment, a maddeningly disgruntled Benya reported that his older brother was indeed a terribly bad person. But he calmly reported that although Benya was the younger brother, he wasn't going to treat him with enough respect. At this point, a maddeningly disgruntled Sasha Sanchez pulled them apart and ordered them both to stop this argument. She looked out the window behind her and wondered if they really had to go in there. After all, they could really get hurt, and so she felt quite worried about that. But the two boys looked at it with determination and said that they really had to get in there. And then Benya added that they had to check what was around the place, for then they would know what part of the estate they were in. But an excited Sasha Sanchez reported that although they were indeed right, but maybe they should have just asked their uncle about it. And then awkwardly rubbing my head, Benya reported that Sasha Sanchez was indeed mentally quite logical, and they should have acted similarly. But she only awkwardly looked around at everyone present and realized that apparently those two guys hadn't specifically asked for anything like that. And I thought that maybe they were just afraid of what they might hear, or maybe they were worried that they might not hear any answer at all. And that's why the awkwardness made it seem like she wasn't the only one who had a bad feeling, and thought about the fact that there was just no point in holding on to that kind of tension any longer. After which she climbed the ladder and reflected that she had to do her best. In the end, she pulled the fabric off the window. But in the end, along with the fabric, the wooden frame flew off and flew towards Benya. At the last moment, the girl managed to scream so that they could dodge. And then a madly disgruntled and still frightened Benya looked at Sasha Sanchez and wondered if she had done something like that on purpose to get back at them for making her climb so high. But she only apologized and wondered unhappily what Lidia's and Benya had been counting on. Everything here was crazy old and collapsed very easily. And then she determinedly continued to climb on, finally looking around to see if she could finally get to that window and get a good look at everything, but grudgingly noted that she could see nothing but sky around her. But when she thought about it, she admitted that at least it was better than not seeing anything at all. And then the voices of a worried Lidia's and Benya called the protagonist and asked her what she had seen and if she could tell them where they were. Then they asked Sasha to look around as best she could and explain it to them. And then looking around, Sasha Sanchez said that she was not sure where they were, but no matter how much she tried to see anything around was just the sky and the earth. But then her gaze changed, and she looked up excitedly at herself, wondering what she had just seen. And then she excitedly noticed that above her was now a huge bell. And at that moment, she turned around, frightened out of her wits, to start climbing down and tell Lidia's and Benya about it. But at that moment, because of this sudden movement, the ladder did not hold and broke right under her feet. At that moment, the two frightened boys immediately reached out their hands to catch her, and eventually she flew in a direction, but it was Benya who caught her, on whom Sasha Sanchez bumped with all her weight, and the blow was so strong that she literally knocked him off his feet. At that moment, a frantically excited Lidia's approached them and looked at Sasha Sanchez and asked if she was all right, and confessed that he had even suspected that the ladder was so fragile. But at that moment, the maddeningly angry Sasha Sanchez only noted that Lidia's had earlier promised that he would catch her if she fell, and thought that Benya had probably hurt himself. So she looked at him worriedly and wondered if he was all right and if he was alive. But the disgruntled boy only told Sasha Sanchez to get off him as soon as possible. Otherwise, she could crush him. Sasha Sanchez finally got up from him a little embarrassed and asked if he was all right and if he had hit himself while falling to the floor. But Benya only smiled and said that apparently Sasha Sanchez had realized that she was heavy, and he was glad that at least she'd admitted it to herself. But the insanely disgruntled girl just thought she should have fallen on this guy as hard as she could so he wouldn't have the strength to say something like that. But at that moment, a worried Litias approached her and gave her a hand so that she could get up and asked what Sasha Sanchez had seen in the window that she had turned around so abruptly. And then she awkwardly reported that she had actually seen bells, and it was the clock tower bell on their estate. And then the excited Benya wondered if they were in the bell tower, and wondered how there was such a place inside the bell tower. And Litias only said that it was all very strange. But Sasha Sanchez asked the boys if none of them knew about this place. And Benya only calmly reported that he could not have known about something like this. Then asked his older brother if he had this information. But he calmly reported that he would never have thought that there could be such a place inside the bell tower. And he did not even have any suspicions about it. And then thinking about it, Litias realized that if they were in the belfry, then the bell would ring very loudly at noon. And an excited Sasha Sanchez only said that she frantically hoped it wouldn't be too loud in this place. Otherwise, Estelle was very scared. And then, thinking about her words, Litias realized that Sasha Sanchez was absolutely right, because their little sister was afraid of loud noises and heights. And then they were unhappily contemplating it. And the protagonist stated that this was indeed the safest place on the estate. So absolutely no one would ever think of coming here. And most people would never think that the bell tower could even be in this place. And no one would ever hear them here. And even if they screamed or made a fuss, it was the only way out. And if you tried to escape through the window, you could easily be crushed to death. In other words, it was a real shelter. But if someone tries to lock them in here forever, it's the perfect place no one's used in years. And those who knew it existed are already dead. At that moment, Benya turned to her and asked her what had happened and why she was so frightened. But she calmly reported that everything was fine, and that since they'd checked that window, she was going back upstairs, and realized that the first thing she'd better do was check on Estelle. Sasha Sanchez took the comb and offered to comb Estelle's hair, and then asked her how she had slept last night, and if she had not been disturbed. But she calmly said that she wanted to be okay. But the place was insanely stuffy, and she really wanted to open the window, after which she grudgingly added that it was also very loud when the bell rang. But at that moment, all Sasha Sanchez could think about was that she never would have guessed she could wear Lady Serpente's dress, because it was pretty much expected that her clothes weren't brought here. And when she told Estelle about it, she just said that Sasha Sanchez could wear her clothes and there would be no problem. Then remembering Estelle, the main character stated that at the moment when the girl thought about it, that she looked madly joyful, as if she was dressing up not a person but a doll. And so Sasha Sanchez was overjoyed because she thought Estelle would be upset if she wore her clothes. But then I thought more seriously about the fact that the butler had said earlier that you could go there in case they needed anything. But for some reason, the butler only came when they were asleep to leave them food. And from then on, neither the butler nor Jerome Hippolyte came again. And eventually the week came to an end. So while tying Estelle's ponytail, the protagonist was thinking about the fact that tomorrow it would be exactly 1 week since they had been here. And she wondered why they had never been visited in this place. Sasha Sanchez smiled happily and asked Estelle if she liked her hair, though she was thinking that maybe something had happened to these people this week. Something that they, being on the bell tower, didn't realize yet. After which, looking at an insanely satisfied Estelle, Sasha hoped she was just worrying about something like that for nothing, and all was well. In the end, they went down to eat, and then Estelle, madly disgruntled, looked at her food and said that she was madly sick of those pancakes, and she was madly indignant that the same food was brought to them every day. Lunches and dinners were disgusting. They were served cold. But Sasha Sanchez said as calmly as possible that today was the end of it all, that tomorrow they would finally leave this place. And then Litias said with a smile that he wanted tomorrow to come, and asked what they would like to eat first when they got out of here. And at this point, Estelle announced that the first thing she wanted to do was to eat all the cheese she could, because she missed it so much. And looking around, Benya said he'd also like to eat some veal stew. So he suggested we attack the chef as soon as they get out of here. But at that moment, everyone looked at Sasha and asked what she would like to eat when she gets out of here. And then for the first time, she just didn't understand what to name. But then she said dreamily that she'd probably like to have a cream pie. And smiling at that answer, Ligia said it was rather expected. He'd given her all his desserts when they were little. And then Sasha Sanchez stated that when her mom found out about it, she got really mad. And Ligia stated that it really wasn't funny at all, because Sasha's mom was really mad. And she was so mad because she thought that Sasha Sanchez was making the kids ask for separate desserts for her. But at that moment, Benya, smilingly looking at the protagonist, reported that in such a case, it was not at all surprising that she was so heavy. And so no one here should have been surprised by something like that. And at that moment, Sasha Sanchez looked back at him and thought that she should have thrown herself at Benya with all her might. But at that moment, Ligia stood up for her and asked his little brother not to be so rude. But he only grudgingly asked what he'd said wrong and seemed completely unaware of his guilt. And Ligia's lay unhappily informed that Benya was beginning to behave abominably again, and it was with his behavior that he had ruined everyone's mood. And Benya was only displeased to be told that apparently he could not even say a word without offending someone, and then told his older brother that he usually started all these arguments and scandals himself, and asked Ligia to finally stop bothering him with his moralizing, for he was acting just like their father. But at this point, the insanely disgruntled Ligia only wondered what his younger brother meant by such words, and seemed to be insanely outraged enough that it might now come to a fight. And then looking at this picture, the protagonist thought about the fact that now there will be another fight, and just hoped that now they will not fight. So yelled at the two, asked them to stop, because they were scaring their little sister insanely bad. And at that moment, looking at their sister, they immediately and awkwardly shut up, and then decided to bother her more. But in the next moment, Benya looked around at everyone present and said that in that case, if we all disliked him so much, he would just leave so as not to anger the people present. And then looking at the door behind which the youngest of the brothers disappeared, Ligia thought that his brother was really unbearable. After all, he knew perfectly well that he was guilty, but absolutely did not want to admit his guilt. But at that moment, the protagonist approached him and took him by the hand and asked Ligia to calm down a little, because he was also not behaving well, and said that fighting with each other would not lead to anything good, and especially the presence of their younger sister. And then a disgruntled Ligia thought that this time he would listen to Sasha and not deal with Benya. But next time he wouldn't let him behave like that, and he wondered grudgingly when that boy would grow up. And then Sasha Sanchez got excited and thought that everyone was getting really nervous. And if this continued, there could be a big fight. And it was no wonder that everyone here was a young villain. But she didn't understand why Benya had become so sensitive. And the next morning, when Sasha Sanchez opened her eyes and realized that it was finally the end of the week and they could get out of here today. And so she picked up her seat and lit candles and went downstairs and thought about the fact that she couldn't sleep at all. And apparently it was because she was insanely excited and wanted to leave the place. But after she had not yet descended the stairs, she noticed the cart in front of her and thought it was rather odd. And when I went downstairs and opened the lid, I saw that there were pancakes for breakfast and everything was normal. But the strange thing was that today they were supposed to leave the place. And so she immediately became agitated, wondering why in that case they had been left food at night as usual. But she asked herself to remain calm, because maybe their plan has changed a little bit, but I didn't know for some reason they weren't notified. And then she started questioning why they always left food out when none of them were around. And she thought it was really abnormal. But the next moment, Benya came up to her and put his hand on her shoulder and asked what she was doing here. And with this sudden behavior, he scared Sasha insanely badly. And then she looked at him unhappily and tried to come to her senses. And the insanely unperturbed boy only asked why Sasha was so frightened and what had happened. Sasha Sanchez looked at him carefully and thought that Benya had probably already recovered from yesterday's fight. So she smiled and said that he woke up early and even washed his face. But the insanely unperturbed Benya only smilingly wondered what Sasha Sanchez was doing here. And she awkwardly admitted that she was actually curious if the butler or Jerome had come today, because today was the day they were supposed to come and get them out of here. But at that moment, the boy said in all seriousness that nevertheless, despite their words, the cart was now in front of them. And then Sasha Sanchez looked at him excitedly and thought that apparently he thought that she did not trust his family, which was madly excited. But Benya rubbed his head unhappily and thought that Jerome had promised that he would come today. And so he was sure that his uncle would come much later, or someone would surely come down to fetch them. so there was no point in waiting here. But then Sasha, pointing at the cart, said that they were putting the food cart out all day anyway. And it was despite the fact that today their uncle said they were supposed to leave this place. And thinking about the girl's words, Benya said that perhaps they had decided to leave more food for them in case they stayed longer. But Sasha Sanchez was embarrassed to say that they were supposed to leave the place today. But no one ever explained anything to them. And not only was nothing explained to her, it wasn't explained to any of the Serpent family either. And then a flustered Benya only wondered what Sasha Sanchez was trying to say with words like that and seemed insanely excited by her behavior. And then Sasha Sanchez was silent, realizing that she couldn't tell Benj that his relatives might be plotting against them. Benya would be very upset with her if she said something like that. And so she didn't know how close she would be to those children in the future. But they weren't close enough for her to talk so openly about something like that. And what she was up to. She looked exactly like the girl in the novel, but she was the wrong Sasha. And maybe that way she could change the plot, and then their relationship could come to a premature end. And once they leave this place, even if she was different from her book character, Sasha Sanchez, but she had to at least strengthen her authority to avoid the tragedy they were to face in the future. And she was sure she had to stay with the Serpent children to the end. So excitedly, she thought about what I should have said. If she said anything unnecessary, Benya would be even more offended. The next moment, Benya slapped her lightly on the forehead. And the maddeningly disgruntled Sasha Sanchez wondered why he'd done that in the first place. But he smilingly noted that the girl had something on her mind, and then wondered if she disliked the new butler that much. He promised that as soon as they were out of here, he would give the man a lesson in manners. And excitedly looking at him, Sasha Sanchez agreed, then thought that she was really much relieved that the boy was in a good mood again. But the next moment, madly dissatisfied Benya reported that he was very hungry, and Sasha Sanchez only wondered why he ran away yesterday without finishing dinner, and wondered what he was doing in the library. And the boy excitedly said that he would like to show Sasha something. Then taking her hand, he immediately started walking to the library. And when she arrived, she saw a pile of broken ladders and awkwardly looked at the boy who was sitting in front of them and asked what he was doing with those ladders. And he calmly said that he was checking which one was the strongest. And a disgruntled Sasha Sanchez only wondered why Benya couldn't start acting like a young aristocrat, and then asked if he was all right, and if he was sure he wouldn't hurt himself. But he calmly climbs up and says that even though he could have gotten hurt, he didn't, and that was the main thing, and smiled brightly as he beckoned her closer to him. But the insanely agitated protagonist only shouted and reported that Benya had obviously gone crazy and ordered him to go back downstairs now. But he just smiled and said that in that case, Sasha Sanchez should have gone up herself and made him come down. And then the insanely disgruntled protagonist thought that maybe she should have just let the little guy die, and that event would have brought peace and stability to their world. And even though she was thinking something like that, she kept going upward. For though she was mad at Benyas, she could not leave him alone. And she thought that if the Duchess were alive, she would strike the rascal for such insolence. The next moment, when she looked out the window, she noticed that there was no one else there. So she wondered excitedly if Benya had fallen, and so immediately took her upstairs and started looking around for the boy. But all she noticed was his smiling face clinging to the stone sculpture holding out his hand to her, and asked that Sasha Sanchez grab his hand and walk down to him. And she only excitedly reported that she almost went crazy because of how much worry she had about him. Then she asked excitedly how Benya thought she was supposed to get down to where he was standing because she might have fallen. But he looked at her with a smile and said she'd be fine. She wouldn't fall. Then he swore she'd be fine and not to worry. And then a frantic Sasha Sanchez realized that it didn't make her feel any better. But still she listened to the boy. And so sitting down on the window frame, she looked around excitedly. And then looking at her, Benya asked her to hold on to his hand and slowly descend to the ledge. And then slowly moving towards Benya, Sasha Sanchez thought that if she died, she would turn into a ghost and haunt the boy the whole time. But the next moment she closed her eyes and jumped. And then Benya left her out of habit, and she was on the ledge. And then holding her close so that Sasha Sanchez would not fall, Benya smiled happily and praised her, and said that she was really good, and acted as if it was not the first time she had climbed such places. But maddeningly displeased, Sasha Sanchez was only thinking that maybe she should have hit that petty aristocrat after all. But eventually, she calmed down and looked around where they were. It was a stone bat ornament on the bell tower. Benya told her that it wasn't as scary as she'd originally thought, but she swore she wouldn't go there a second time. Sasha wondered if this was what Benya wanted to show her, and he said with a happy smile, looking at the dawn, that yesterday's sunset seemed much better to him. And the excited Sasha Sanchez only wondered if he'd been here all day yesterday. But the awkward guy reported that although he hadn't been here all day, but he was just curious about what it was like outside. And he started thinking about something. And then Sasha Sanchez, who was looking at him excitedly, asked what he was thinking about. But he admitted that he was thinking about all sorts of things, and his parents, and everything to do with that. And the worried protagonist only looked sadly at the boy and wondered if he was all right in connection with his reflections. But at that moment, instead of answering her question, the guy calmly lowered his gaze and informed Sasha that he was insanely glad she had survived. But at this point, the protagonist awkwardly wondered what he meant. But he just calmly gazed into the distance and said that he had absolutely no idea what would have happened to their little sister if Sasha Sanchez hadn't been around. For Estelle needed the girl far more than she needed him and his older brother. Then he said that he realized that if Sasha wasn't with them, he and Licia's would have fought a long time ago. And then thinking about what he said, the protagonist realized that it was probably true. There had never been much affection between the brothers, and Licia's and Estelle were relatively close to each other. But Benya preferred to be alone. And Benya was not as kind and gentle as Licia's. It was for that reason that Benya had just told her that it was quite shocking. So all she could say was that everything was bound to be fine. But eventually, when they were in the room, a flustered Licia's came in, looking around at them and wondering what the two of them had done here. But Benya looked at him calmly and asked how long he had been awake. And at that moment, Licia's calmly said that he had woken up recently. He looked at his brother carefully and wondered if they had decided to seclude themselves in this place, and wondered what was going on here. But Benya calmly said that he had been thinking about the priorities they needed to set in their family when they got out of this place. And at that moment, Mad Evil Big Brother told Benjamin that he had also thought about it and told him not to get so cocky. But he only calmly exhaled and stated that his brother could have quietly passed on his title as heir. But he only grudgingly inquired whether his brother was a madman. He would surely destroy the family if he gave him the title. But Benya smiled and said that he didn't mean himself, and said that he could pass the title to Sasha. But Licia's calmly reported that his brother should have thought hard about it, and Sasha Sanchez could chase them away at any time and still leave nothing behind. But Benya calmly reported that it was just his opinion. But at that moment, Sasha Sanchez was not sad that they were arguing. She thought about the fact that all the children had fought from time to time. But because of what she had seen earlier, she could conclude that Benya, Licia's, and Estelle were not like villains. And despite the fact that these kids were the reason Sasha Sanchez had spent the whole week in a frenzy of tension, she was thrilled that they would be able to leave here today. So she awkwardly exhaled and asked them to stop arguing, and wondered if she really shouldn't have taken things so personally. But in the end, even when it got dark, no one came to them the next day, and the day after that, and even 2 days later. And then Estelle unhappily reported that she thought they'd only been in this place for a week, and she didn't understand why they were still here. She looked at her brothers and said that they were all liars, and she did not believe any of them. But at that moment, Sasha Sanchez entered the conversation and with a smile told Estelle not to talk like that, and suggested that she should eat a little first. After all, today was going to be the last day anyway. But Estelle only grudgingly said that she didn't want to eat because she was already throwing up. And Sasha Sanchez kept saying the same thing every day. And then the main character thought that it was already a real problem. But at that moment, Lydias entered the conversation and calmly looked at his sister and said that they should finish their meal, as the situation must have worsened, and for their uncles and their relatives. And then turning to the younger sister, informed her that she was the lady of the Serpent family, and she had to be able to wait patiently and sit quietly. But then approaching her and comfortingly placing a hand on her shoulder, Sasha Sanchez reflected that it had been 2 weeks, and no one had come to them, but still continued to leave them food. And so she thought that maybe they had something going on that they didn't know about, and thought that maybe she shouldn't go to bed and see if anyone was in the place. But at that moment, their uncle Jerome Hippolyte walked in on them. The man ended up at the same table as the children and excitedly informed them that he clearly should have come to them a little earlier, and apologized. Then stated that they had probably already guessed that their plans had changed. And the protagonist only grudgingly looked back at him and wondered if it was really obvious that it had been twice as long as planned. But Lichas was still calm, so he looked carefully at his uncle and asked what had happened and if someone had died again. Then he calmly said that the doctors from the capital had come to the manor, and by the way he spoke, it was clear to everyone what he was trying to say. Then Benya asked unhappily if he hadn't come here to get them. Then added grudgingly that he didn't realize how serious the situation outside must have been, but strongly reported that they simply couldn't be here any longer. Whereupon, looking at his uncle, stated that he must have been well aware of their little sister's poor health, but he would only give a grudging look of inquiry. Did they really think it was of their own free will that they had decided to shut them down here? Because the people who came to the funeral, as well as the presiding bishop and his family, and even the people who were just carrying the bodies, all died of infection. And so he didn't understand how children could be so frivolous as to even contemplate something like that under such circumstances. But at that moment, Sasha Sanchez lay agitated, wondering how they were even supposed to live in such conditions. After all, they had no roomers or maids, and this place was so small, there was hardly any privacy. Not to mention some space to run or keep fit. And also, they're already insanely tired of eating the same food day in and day out. And the bathtub was so cold, the water was so cold that their bones ached when they showered. And the library only had old books that were hard to read. And there were no games to pass the time. So she didn't understand how they were any different from pets of similar conditions. But the next moment, the man looked over Sasha unhappily and wondered if the clothes she was wearing belonged to his niece. And then, excitedly clutching Estelle to her, the protagonist announced that she had no other clothes, and so she had to wear this. And then the agitated man said that he really hadn't thought of it, and apologized to Estelle for such a thing, and promised to tell the butler to bring the maid's clothes. At which point, a maddeningly disgruntled Benya inquired what was wrong with the butler, and why he was secretly coming in and out every time, for it was very strange, because this man seemed to care absolutely nothing about what was going on outside, and reported that they could no longer eat the same things. And it felt like they were like livestock, and then demanded that he at least be given a normal explanation for such behavior. But Jerome Hippolyte excitedly reported that they knew when the situation on the street would improve. For until the damn plague subsided, he had to do everything to keep his nephew safe. After all, if he had to guard anyone, it was them. And then Sasha Sanchez snuggled closer to her. Estelle wondered if it was really bad to complain in a situation like this. But they really couldn't be here anymore. And then the insanely serious Benya asked his uncle to tell him when they could leave here. And then they would try to bear it all no matter how long it took, and whatever the situation outside, and demanded that his uncle just stop torturing them. In answer, they would be very angry with Jerome Hippolyte if he continued to deceive them. And then the maddeningly tense man informed them that they would have to stay here for another month and no more. And then, thinking about his words, Benya excitedly asked why a whole month, because that was quite a long time, and they wouldn't want to spend that much more time here. But the agitated uncle only informed me that he understood perfectly well that he could not ask the children to stay here any longer, because even adults would find it insanely hard to be here. It was even harder for them. After which he asked to hold out for only a month, after which he promised that he would definitely take them away to study, no matter what the foreign policy situation was. But he would sincerely try to get them out. Then I looked at them one last time before I left and asked if they understood what they were supposed to do, and they just said yes, even though they were madly upset about it. Eventually, after some more time, as promised uncle, he brought things to Sasha, her clothes, and so she dressed up in her usual uniform, looking back at herself in. And Estelle, madly disgruntled, only stated that she had had enough fun dressing Sasha up in her clothes, and wondered if the girl could ever wear her clothes again. And Sasha, minding her own business and looking at her uniform, stated that she had been right when she thought Estelle enjoyed dressing her up, but afterwards said with a smile that she wanted to show Estelle the stove they had been allotted, and said that the girl would now be able to take a warm bath. But she only held back tears and wondered why she had to do it at all. It was too dreary, and she didn't want to do something like that. And then Sasha looked at her sadly and realized that it was indeed so. It would be a difficult task to stay in this place for a month without any entertainment. But they didn't need much more than that. Just something to distract them so they can have something to do this month. And so down the stairs, Sasha thought about also having space for them to run and play. And the last thing is a window so they can always know the date and time. But after reflecting on her own thoughts, the protagonist realized she knew the perfect place, but it was too dirty. So she never even thought they could play there. Finally, when she went into the library, she looked around at the horror that was there. There were cobwebs all over the place, and broken stairs, and scattered books. And then looking around, Sasha thought that it was not surprising that they did not come here to play. But the next moment she was called by Benya's voice, who looked excitedly at the main character and asked what she was doing here. When she turned around and looked at him, he scrutinized her face and wondered why she was frozen in one place, But Sasha calmly explained that she thought it was a good idea to spend more time in the library, but it was worth cleaning up a bit first. After all, if it was a lot cleaner, his sister could play in this place. But a surprised Benya informed that although it was just an awesome idea, but he absolutely did not understand how the protagonist was going to clean up the place. And she just stared at him in amazement, not knowing what he was talking about. But then she remembered a simple truth, that she forgot that Benya was a noble young man and the son of a duke. So he'd probably never even seen a doormat in his life. But at that moment, they were approached by Licias, who asked what they were doing here and what they were discussing. And then Benya calmly explained that Sasha wanted to tidy up this room and organize a place to play in it. But he only looked at Sasha in surprise and asked how she was going to do it. They couldn't even get servants here, but she calmly informed him that they already had a servant. At this moment, approaching the protagonist, they excitedly inquired where they had servants, and did the girl see anyone here but the butler. But she maddeningly awkwardly informed them that they had misunderstood, after which she reminded them that she herself was a servant, and they should not forget her original function. And then the two boys looked at Sasha excitedly and wondered if she was really going to clean this place alone. But then, smiling, the protagonist said that she thought it would be much easier if she had help. After all, they'd been trapped in this place for a month anyway. So looking around, the boys informed her that this month would go much faster if they found something to do. And then, thinking about it, they agreed. And at that moment, joyfully looking around the room, Sasha suggested that they start by dusting.